On today's Fast to Beyond 50 podcast, we're going to be talking about something that a lot of runners over the age of 50 struggle with. Maybe you're one of the runners who really struggle with this, where you run really well over 5 or 10Ks and it's just almost impossible to translate the times that you could be running, your ability, into the longer distances. So whether half marathon up to a marathon. If that is you, this is the podcast that you want to be listening to. My name is Brad Nadauld. I've got the coach, Lindsey Parry, with me today. Lindsey, this is something that a lot of runners struggle with. They super fast over a 5K, maybe a park run or a 10K, and then they go online and they look at the online calculators and it predicts what your half marathon time should be or your marathon time. And then they go and train for that. And on race day, things fall apart and it just does not come close to what their predicted ability is. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is to how to get those numbers matching so that you are able to run at your predicted ability, so you can run those longer races as best you can. Lindsey, what are some of the most common, let's dive straight into, what are some of the most common reasons runners struggle to translate those shorter distance times into the longer ones?
Yeah, so Brad, there's quite a long list. And it's quite funny how when we make running mistakes, is that often we can get away with one or two, but then more than that is where it becomes catastrophic. In this case, where people are particularly struggling on the marathon, it's often one or more of the mistakes that they are making. So the really common ones are, just not training properly. And that's super vague, but we will unpack it. Don't worry. It's not having the strength to be able to convert those longer distances, because as we get older, we lose strength. So we'll definitely dive into that one in a lot more detail. Not getting your nutrition right on race day is a biggie. Very poor pacing strategies is a big indicator. And of course, there are these physiological differences in athletes that need to also be taken into account. And then finally, I would say environmental factors often play a role. And because we are so intimate with what we're doing, that seems like such an obvious one, but I've had instances where I'm like gone through everything and I just literally can't understand why an athlete hasn't been able to convert. And then they've made a comment in passing, and it turned out that they are living at sea level, and the two races that have gone so badly for them were run at altitude, and then you're like, oh, well, actually, if I do the altitude conversion, you didn't run so badly. So yeah, that's kind of a less common and in some ways funny reason, but it shows you that a lot of people, even when they've been running for a long period of time, don't quite understand how everything comes together to impact the body.
Yeah, and Lindsey, it's one of those things, the longer you go, the more of those factors compound and then things really fall apart. But we're going to dig into all of those reasons and how to improve them in this podcast. And before we really dive into it, I just want to give a quick shout out to James Willock, who left us a review on Apple Podcasts. We really do appreciate that. James, it does really help other runners over the age of 50 find this podcast. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you a Coach Parry water bottle for doing that. We really do appreciate it. Lindsey, before we dive into the first of the factors that you've just mentioned, if you look at the math of this, right? So, and I'm not a huge one for doing public math, so I hope I don't mess this up. For a lot of, it's not a linear progression. That's, I think, one thing we have to understand, and let's get into the reasons of that. It's not like if you run an hour 10K, your half marathon time is going to be 2 hours 6, and your marathon's then going to be 4:12. It's not an exact linear thing. There's obviously lots of factors that play into it. So how realistic is that expectation to have it almost exactly the same?
No, so to expect it to be linear is crazy talk, because there's like a completely different relative intensity that is involved. And to be honest, that probably ties in quite well into this poor pacing, which we're going to touch on just now. But people do make the mistake of making the incorrect calculation. But it's actually one of the ways that we use to kind of try and figure out the strengths and weaknesses of a particular athlete. So someone who's training well, that's doing the right sessions at the right time, at the right intensities, because that's the biggest mistake that runners make. So somebody who's training well and doing all of those things correctly and doing strength training. Okay, so we are assuming now a well-prepared athlete, and they say run a 20-minute 5K, which should translate to about a 42-minute 10K, which should then translate to about a 135 half marathon, which in turn should translate to about a 3-hour 14 marathon. Okay, that's very rough. I can do a proper calculation just now for a different example if we want to, but that kind of gives you what the progression should look like. Okay, so now if we get an athlete that's capable of a 20-minute 5K, and their 10K and 5K, if they're well trained, will almost always tie in pretty well. Okay, the slip, if it comes, the slip generally comes from 10Ks to 21Ks. But sometimes we see someone actually is relatively faster. So we're predicting about a 135. Some people will go to like 137, 138, maybe even slower. Others will tend closer to a 132, 131. Okay. Now, just park that for a moment, because then what happens when we move to the marathon is that slip generally gets worse. Okay. So instead of now being on a 314, the 21 that's now slipped to like, let's call it a 140, is now pointing to like a 328 to 330 marathon, but now we're running a 340 to 345 marathon. Okay, so that slip goes up. And on the other side, that 132, which now points to a 310, and maybe that person comes in a 308. So we get this declining time against expectation, or this increasing time against expectation. So typically, in a very well-trained individual that is pacing themselves appropriately and getting their nutrition right, that will then tell us that there's an underlying physiology that gives them a greater strength in short distance. In other words, they've got a higher proportion of fast twitch and type 2 fast twitch muscles. And then the people who get relatively faster as they go longer, and even once they've run that fast time, they really struggle. They want to go back now and get their 5K to match their marathon, but they can't. Those people will have a very high proportion of slow twitch muscle fibers, highly resistant to fatigue, can maintain a relatively higher percentage of their threshold without fatiguing, versus people who have got lots of fast twitch and type 2 slow twitch muscles. So that's really what the difference is on a physiological scale that would cause some people to just actually never be able to quite translate. Brad, what's important about this is that they still can get closer. And I have seen this now with two of my athletes that are like unbelievably fast at 5Ks, effectively should be smashing 4 hours for the marathon, but have never been able to do it. Got quite close last year, and then did an incredible half marathon, and now they've decided that's it. Sub 4 is doable. And the way we've done it with both of these two athletes is so unorthodox, but it's incorporating part of their strength into their long training runs and then into their racing strategy. So the first thing that I did with them is introduced proper regular walk breaks, okay? And that made a hell of a difference already. So this guy who should have been running under 4 hours was running 420 pluses, okay? Couldn't even get under 420. Introduced the run walk, and then that, I think we got into about 406. So there, but still not there. But then his half marathon, which you always should have been doing sub 115s, could never get there. What we changed and incorporated was that we would run for a period of time, that we figured out what sort of time works best for him. And I think we got to 10 minutes. 15 minutes was a bit long. So I think we got to 10 minutes. And then he would do 5 30-second intervals with a walk break in between. Okay. So I know the people listening to this are going, this sounds wild. Okay. Because when I thought this up, I was like, I'm going to try this, but let's see. And I'll tell you why we decided to experiment with it, because it was also a little bit of an accident how we discovered that this works. And then after those 5 30-second intervals, which weren't crazy fast, but they were faster than the marathon pace that he needs to maintain, with a short walk in between, and then a 2-minute walk, and then back to his 10 minutes. Okay. And then we do these intervals again. And we repeated this for 21 Ks, and he obliterated the 21K, like 148 or something ridiculous. Bearing in mind he's in his 60s. But we discovered this because when I would give him these workouts as kind of stimulation for before we started doing speed work, and he just told me, Lindsey, you got no idea how good I feel running after we've done those little things. So I was like, well, actually he was like, can we try those on the Saturday long run? And I was like, you know what? Let's see. Let's do it on a long run. My instinct is that there will be a slow degradation of neural fatigue, and so by the end, it won't work. And his words to me were, it's like I reset my clock every time I do that. So as I'm starting to feel like my aerobic is letting me down, very bad use of words there, but it gives the idea of what I'm trying to convey. And then these things would give him his reset, and he'd feel fantastic for his next section. And this would go on for 2.5 hours. And he'd finish his runs feeling so good. And really to summarize everything that I've said is that I think that people that are extremely high on fast twitch muscle get neural fatigue. So they don't just get the general tiredness that we are getting. They can train themselves to be aerobically strong. In other words, they can train themselves to keep sending oxygen to the working muscles, but they also start to get neural fatigue. And I think that change of when we just, that fixes it. And that's there's nothing proven in this. This is just my brain trying to work out why this has worked so well. But anyway, that was like a complete aside, nothing scientific in that. It's worked. And then I've tried it on another athlete that was also struggling with this conversion, and it works. But most of the time, it's not as complicated an issue as that, Brad. It's normally one of those much simpler things, which is picking the right target, actually pacing yourself to that target, getting your nutrition right, making sure you do your strength training, and making sure that you're actually training at the right intensities at the right times for the goal that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I was trying to think how I would manage that, Linz, because I'm terrible when it comes to trying to work things out about 30 Ks into a marathon. And it reminds me of a race I did many years ago where I needed to go at 7 minutes a kilometer for the last 10 Ks to go under the goal that I wanted. And I was trying to work out, no, I didn't need to go. I had 70 minutes for the last 10 Ks. So I was trying to work out how many minutes per kilometer that is. And I was going 70 divided by 10, and I couldn't work it out. So I don't know how and I missed the goal, I might add, because I couldn't work it out. But it took me about half an hour to figure out what 70 divided by 10 was, and then I messed it up. So, yeah, I don't know how that would work for me, but I think for a lot of people it's super, super interesting. Lindsey, before we dive into the first one of the you're saying a watch, got to do your watch with the beeps. Jeez, that's a lot of beeps to keep track of.
But can I tell you, when you're doing it that complicated, it is a lot of beeps. And so you have to be very careful about how you set your ranges up, because if you get the ranges wrong, then your watch just shouts at you for 2 hours.
All the time. That's too good. Lindsey, before we dive into the first of the sort of factors that plays into this, you were talking about like the different types of people, like the people who can translate to the longer ones, they get faster or slower. Is it like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? So like a third of runners get slower as they progress longer, a third of runners have got it waxed that their 5K does predict to what their marathon they're capable of, and then the other third is the other way around, where they actually get faster. Or is it smaller proportions?
No, I'd probably say it's something more like 70, 25, 5. So the people who get faster as they go along are a small percentage, and they also tend to be females, to be honest, and that's largely because females tend to pace themselves far more conservatively. So I mean, I am thumb sucking those numbers just a little bit, but the majority are slower at the marathon than they should be. And then there's a reasonable chunk of people that get it right or within a minute or two. And then there's a pretty small crowd that get better as they go longer.
All right, cool. Lindsey, let's jump into the first one, because obviously a lot that happens on race day, it does have an impact, but you've got to start before then, and that goes down to training. And there's a lot that goes into this. So I don't want to dive too deep into the training stuff. If you do need help with the training, we've got Fast to Beyond 50 training frameworks that can help you do this. But what are some of the big mistakes that you see with people making in their training that on race day, when it comes around, they struggle to translate those 5 and 10K times to better half marathon and marathon times?
So literally 3, and one of them is less of a training mistake and more of an omission in strength training. Okay, so I'm just going to start there because it's easy. But strength training, runners over 50, is probably one of the bigger reasons why people aren't translating. Okay, and then from a pure training point of view, the two things that are tripping people up is that they train too much. Okay, so we are used to training like we've always trained. And as we get older, that tends to trip us up because we can't handle quite as much training as we did. So that compromises our recovery. And then the third and probably biggest mistake all runners on the planet make, but we get punished more as we get older, is that you do your easy and long runs too fast. So those are literally the 3 big things if you can sort out in your training. If you just slightly drop your volume to give yourself a bit more time to recover, if you fix the pace of your long runs in particular, but also your easy runs, make a huge difference to not going into race day tired, and then add strength training.
All right, cool. I was gonna jump into the pacing side of things, but strength training is one of those that is crucial, particularly as we are in our 50s, 60s, and beyond. So from a training perspective, this is another thing that really does add bang for your buck in the build up to race day. It doesn't matter if you get everything perfect on race day. If you haven't done this, you are going to struggle. So strength training for the over 50s run, I mean, we bang on about it here at Coach Parry all the time. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, or if you've watched any of our YouTube videos, you'll know we are huge advocates of strength training. Lindsey, just in a nutshell, when we talk strength training, what are we talking about, and sort of how much and how often? If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury-free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsey and I for our upcoming Fast to Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K, and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now, or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, so the biggest problem for a lot of people is that they cite either time or that they really just don't enjoy strength training. So, we are talking resistance training, but it doesn't have to be in a gym. So we want some resistance training. And when you've done no strength training for 30 years, doing a squat of your own body weight is strength training. So you can start in the comfort of your own home with body weight exercises. We're obviously focusing on the legs, but in terms of our overall health and longevity, I would also encourage people to do some upper body, but specifically for improving your actual marathon time, we're looking at squats, we're looking at single leg squats, we're looking at step ups onto a low step to begin with. And if you carry on being consistent doing this, we can move to higher steps, but a low step, something like a step in your actual house, and then some glute strengthening exercises like fire hydrants or donkeys or side-lying leg raises on a basic front. But essentially, those 4 exercises are the basis for what you need to do. And that's what I've just told you now. If you do 2 to 3 sets of starting with maybe 6 to 8 and then building that up over a period of time to 12 to 15. If you do that, you're talking about starting with needing 15 minutes 2 to 3 times a week and ultimately ending up with about half an hour 2 to 3 times a week. It's not tons of time. It's something you can actually do while you're watching a program or the news or something like that. So we're looking at 2 to 3 times a week. Of course, once you get into it and you feel the benefits, hopefully you'll do more. But those are really the basics that will help you to improve your basic strength. And you'll get nice positive spin-offs too. Less risk of injury, improved running performance, improved running mechanics, improved running efficiency. So there are other good spin-offs other than just doing better in your marathon. It'll really help your day-to-day running recovery and just make you a better athlete.
Yeah, and also reduces your risk of injury, which helps with consistency, which again makes you a better runner in the long term. And as we get older, that just becomes more and more important. Lindsey, let's now dive into pacing. And we've done a real deep dive on that here on this podcast. I will share the link. We did that with one of our coaches, Ntutu Litseke. If you haven't watched that, it is phenomenal. But pacing is a big one. And you can get this horribly wrong, and the margins are quite small, particularly as you go longer for it to unravel quickly.
Yeah, and that's it. The longer you go, the more you get punished. So typically people who pace badly across all the distances. So even if you are running good 5Ks and not translating those into the marathons, if you go and analyze all of your distances, you'll quickly work out if this is you. Because typically what will happen is we'll unravel approximately 2/3 into a 5, 10, 21. But in a 5 and a 10, 2/3 in, you've only got to hang on for a few minutes. 21, 7 kilometers, 3 miles, that's not an insignificant amount to hang on. In a marathon, almost 15 kilometers, 13 and a half kilometers, 7 miles, give or take. That's a long time to be hanging on. So that's really where part of the issue comes, that if we're pacing badly, that gap just gets wider and wider the longer the race is. So have a look at all of your races and look at your training sessions. So you'll see, you'll start to pick up patterns. You get people who will do an interval set, let's say it's 6 400s, and they'll slowly get slower across the 6 400s. Or what's quite a common pattern is that they'll be very fast over the first 250 and then start tailing off as they get to the end of the 400. So you'll start seeing, and maybe 400 is a bit short to see that. Maybe 800 is a better example to use there. An 800 or a 1K repeat. When you're doing the long repeats, you'll see that they're quite consistent in terms of their finishing time, but they all tail off. Always start faster. So those are the kind of things you can look for in your training and in your shorter distance races to try and pick up, are you that person that just keeps going out too hard? In the marathon, it's easier to get your pacing wrong. So often people don't pace too badly, but then come marathon day, because relatively speaking, the right intensity to be running at in the first quarter often just feels like a little bit too easy. Like you don't, in fact, running too fast, should I say, feels easy. That's probably a better way of wording it, Brad. It's that you're running along feeling so comfortable that you think, no, man, I'm obviously just having a really fantastic day. And it's only then normally around the 23, 24, 25K mark, 14, 15 miles that you start to go like, yo, actually, now I can feel that I've overdone it. And then within 3 miles, you are really starting to battle. Okay. So that's that's how most people get it wrong, is they can't feel where they're supposed to be. And again, teaching yourself to pace properly over shorter normally improves your pacing over longer anyway. So if you are struggling with the feeling part of it, you can work on it on shorter distances. And those strategies will be the same strategies you'll use on marathon day. But hopefully by the time you get to marathon day, you actually will feel better about feeling that pacing. Okay, so on race day for a marathon and or 5K, 10K, whatever it is, set out your realistic target. That's always the most important thing. Look at what your average pace required for the duration of that marathon is, and then look at the marathon route itself and go, right, how flat is this? Do I have to run a lot of hills, no hills? Okay, it's reasonably flat. Well, if I am more than 3 seconds, 3 seconds is already right on the borderline, but if you are more than 3 seconds per K, which translates to about 5 seconds per mile, faster than the average pace required in the first half, I'm going to run into trouble. So you really want to be within 1 to 3 seconds of your average time on a flat marathon, 1 to 3 seconds of your average pace to halfway. I would say 2 minutes is the real fine line. So anything faster than 2 minutes, so if you're going for a 4 hour, anything faster than 1 hour 58 is putting you at risk of blowing up a bit in the second half. So you want to be between 158 and 201. That's your window that you want to aim to go through. So you basically want to be right in and around. And people struggle with that concept because they just feel like they are going to be tired at the end. And you're going to be tired at the end. However, if you pace yourself this way, you get close enough to the finish that you can dig in and just keep doing what you need to do to get to the finish and run your time. When it becomes difficult to do that mentally is when you've just got too many kilometers or miles left to get that right. And getting the marathon right is one of the hardest things to do in sport. Certainly in road running, but in sport, is to get your ultimate marathon. And part of that is because the margin for error is quite small. And we've only discussed one aspect. So we've got to train properly, and we've got to set the right goal, and we've got to pace correctly to that right goal.
Yeah, lots of factors. No, it's definitely not easy. Lots of factors that could go wrong if you get it wrong. And like we said, it unravels very quickly in a marathon, particularly the longer you go, the more unforgiving it is. You've got to get these spot on. The next one is nutrition, Lindsey. And this one plays a big part along with pacing because you can get your pacing right, but if your nutrition's off, you are going to suffer as well. Let's dig into the nutrition side of things.
Yeah, so again, nutrition, they often go hand in hand because nutrition and being physically or going too fast, you kind of feel the impact at a similar point, okay? But if you've done one well and the other one not so well, then it won't be as bad in the closing stages. But if you get both wrong, that's when you literally have those like long walk to freedom where you're doing very little running and lots of walking. But also, one way to figure out quickly if it's nutrition rather than training is that your body responds quickly to nutrition. So if you do hit a flat spot in a race and you take in a high carbohydrate something and you start to feel better within the next 5 to 10 minutes, then you know you've just blown your nutrition. Now, in a race itself, if that happens to you, people often think, oh no, but if you get into that, then all that happens is you get into the cycle of up and down and up and down. That's true because most people will take the nutrition and then feel fine and then make the same mistake that they made to get themselves there, and that's to not taking enough. So once you hit one of those spots, you've got to feed yourself out of that, okay? And you can. So you just take nutrition regularly from that point to the finish, and that can really rescue your race. But as a general principle, let's first try to work out what your nutritional needs are, and then give that to yourself in race day, and practice it before race day, and do some shorter sessions where you practice the nutrition at race intensity. Okay, so those are three concepts in nutrition that are important. One, how much do I need? Now, a pretty good rule of thumb is 1 gram of carbohydrates per hour of what. Listen to me. 1 gram of carbohydrates per kg of body weight per hour. Okay, so now there's already some people out there like that are looking at this and going, that's a ridiculous amount of carbohydrates. And so for your 80 kgs plus, that is very difficult to get in. I'd say probably up to 70 kgs is for most, but that's why you need to practice it. But most people can get to about 70 grams of carbohydrates per hour if they train, okay? But we don't have to take in the full 70 grams per hour if we are smart. So if you do eat well the night before, and I don't mean stuff your face with carbohydrates and go crazy, but if you eat well the night before, plus you take in some good carbohydrates with your morning meal when you wake up, and then you slowly sip on an energy drink up to the race, then you're going to go into the race with really nice, full glycogen stores in your muscles, and that immediately reduces the number of carbs you need per hour. So if I use myself, 75 kgs, that means I've got approximately 150 grams of stored carbohydrates in my muscles when I start, okay? So I'm going to try and run 3 hours in Berlin. So we divide 150 by 3. So I've actually already got 50 grams at my disposal that are there. So that means that my absolute minimum that I must take in is 30 grams per hour. If I don't take in 30 grams per hour, I'm going to get into trouble. But I also want to try and have a glycogen sparing effect. I don't want to empty my glycogen stores, because if I get deep into the race and when you're very fatigued, or if the temperature starts to go up, or you've lost a ton of fluids and it starts to become harder for your body to assimilate and process those carbohydrates, then I want to know that I'm going to be okay for the last bit. So I really want to take care of good nutrition early. And so I will try to get close to between 60 and 70 grams per hour. And I promise you, anything more than 30 requires training. So 30 is easy. It's 1 gel an hour. Basically, anyone can do that. So getting more than that, 2 gels an hour, or as I like to do it, a gel every 45 minutes or so, plus taking energy drink along the way. And that's, again, I'm proving my own point, as you've got to practice it, because you've got to figure out what works well for you as an individual, and how am I going to get that 70 grams in. But you can train it in training, get your gut used to it, and then you just do 2 trial runs of between 8 and 16 kilometers, 5 miles, 10 miles, so that you can just do it at marathon pace and just get used to taking that amount in. Then if you do that, by the time you get to 32 to 35 Ks, if you stop taking nutrition, then it's okay, because you know that you've got those glycogen stores. But if you're someone who really struggles to take these products in while you're running a marathon, you can work it back and go, okay, I'm going to try for 35 or 40 per hour. I'm going to go closer to the 30, once I've taken my glycogen stores into account. So there's figuring out, what do I need? 2, how am I going to get it in? 3, practice that leading into race day. And then, of course, what's very important is to do number 4, because I know this is particularly hard to believe, but I've got one friend who does this on multiple occasions a year. Oh, I forgot to take my nutrition. I don't know how you do that, but people do. So then it's actually executing your plan and taking the nutrition at the right time.
Yeah, Lindsey, it's quite interesting just hearing you talk about the sort of the difference between how you know if it's your training or if it's your nutrition. And just as you were explaining that, I ran a marathon last October, and that happened to me at about 32 Ks in. I mean, you do hit a patch in a marathon where it's really hard, and I was just really feeling super flat. So at the next aid station, I'd like put anything with carbohydrates down my throat, and felt a lot better almost immediately. So it was just interesting hearing that now, because I've got another marathon coming up in 4 weeks, and now that I know that that's what it was, I just need to make sure that I'm fueling better in the build up to that point in the marathon, so that I don't get to that point again. So that is super interesting. The next, I don't want to say factor, because there's multiple factors that form this one, is less obvious than the nutrition and the pacing. I mean, those are the two real obvious ones that people get wrong. But the next one is the conditions. And I don't think enough of us take into account the conditions on race day and how that impacts the translation from the 5 and 10K to a half marathon or marathon time. And there's a few different things that play into this. And it could be temperature, it could be altitude, it could be humidity. And you've got to factor these things in, because they do play a major role. And often we don't. We just think, we've got the plan, we've got the nutrition plan, we've got the pacing plan, and we're just going to go for it. Whatever happens outside of that, we don't actually worry about.
100%. And I'll start on the easiest one to account for, and that is very cold. Okay. So we already know that from a physiological point of view, and for the body to shell heat, being in fairly, for us, cold, but let's call them cool conditions, is ideal. So ideal running conditions are somewhere between 9 and 14 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that's like really the optimal marathon temperature for elite athletes. So that might change up or down a bit depending on your age and a few other factors. But for argument's sake, when it's colder than that, so when we get into those single figures and it is quite cold, it's important to understand that your body is going to utilize some of the energy towards heating you up. Okay. And therefore your nutritional requirement on race day will go up slightly. So it's actually much easier to account for colder weather. And in colder weather, typically, I don't see a need to change your goal in any way. It's pretty easy also to add a layer or two that often just helps bump up the body temperature, and then a slight tweak to the nutrition. And that will normally just take care of the fact that it's cold. Obviously, in very extreme, when we get down into the minuses, we do need to start looking at adjusting goal race times. But again, clothing will compensate a lot for that, but that clothing can also in some instances become slightly restrictive. So there's definitely some adjustment that's needed when it gets too cold, -4, 5, 6, 7. We need to rethink our strategy and of course the danger factor, ice, snow, etc. The bigger issue, of course, is arriving for a race. And this typically happens in the spring and the autumn, fall and spring, is that temperatures are highly volatile. So you are equally likely to get 10 degrees as you are to get 24 degrees. Okay. Now, 24 degrees, I know for you and I, Brad, is nothing, because that's what we run in every day. But it's also part of the reason why South Africans always find it so much easier to run fast when they leave South Africa, is because they don't have to deal with 24 degrees. So what happens when it's hot, and in particular what happens when it's hot and humid? Okay, so your ability to stick close to your original goal time in those conditions will depend entirely on your ability to keep your body cool. So as soon as your body starts to struggle to keep your body temperature down, you will be forced to slow down by your own brain. You won't be able to override it. And the reason you won't be able to override it is because overriding riding it is dangerous. So in the few individuals that are headstrong enough to just ignore all the signs, your body will basically just eventually put you to sleep. So those are the people you see that are lying on the side of the road. Okay. So we do need to downregulate our goal in hot and humid environments, and we have to help it as much as we can by putting ice down our tops, putting ice under our hats, maybe having cooling garments. That is, when you sweat into them, the garments themselves have a chemical reaction and that cools you. And so that then cools your skin, and you can cool your body down by conduction rather than convection, which is what we normally use. We normally sweat, and that evaporation of the sweat is what releases a lot of the heat from our body. So that's why in hot but dry conditions, we tend not to underperform nearly as badly as in hot, humid conditions, because you sweat, but the sweat doesn't evaporate. But if you have the right type of garments, you can then get that loss through some actual direct conduction. It works quite well. Ice bands, keeping yourself wet when you get to water points, especially if they're keeping the drinks cold in ice and water, you can pour that on yourself. But I would also just readjust my time goal. But the cooler you can keep yourself, the less you will need to adjust your time goal. And then the other equally, heat and humidity, and then the other equally tough one to deal with is high altitude. And fortunately, those three combinations together are rare. You very rarely get high altitude, heat, and humidity. High altitude tends to have lower humidity. So, yeah, I mean, that's it. You've essentially got to adjust what you are doing, and at altitude in particular. So altitude, the conversions are normally a lot easier. Depending on how well trained the individual is, you're looking at roughly 4 to 7% drop off in performance. So again, typically, if you've trained really well, you're probably closer to the 4%. If you know you haven't really prepared as well as you should for a marathon, you're probably going to be closer to the 7% off of your target time. You're muted, Brad.
Sorry, let me turn that back on. And those are the things we've thought about lots here at CoachParry.com, and particularly around this podcast and the information we want to get out there. So I mean, there's so much you can go into on running in heat and humidity and altitude and preparing for it. Obviously, that's on race day, but there are things you can do in the build-up too if you know that is what it's going to be like on race day. So if those are sort of deep dive topics you'd love us to talk about, please let us know in the comments. You can also ask a question if you've got any follow-up questions. The link is in the description as well, both on YouTube and on the audio podcast as well. We love questions. We love answering them in our Q&A episode. So if you've got any, or if this conversation has sparked any for you, please do let us know as well. Lindsey, I think we've covered a lot here today. Is there anything that you think we've missed? I think we've done a pretty comprehensive job on getting this right, but obviously a lot boils down to training. And as I said at the start of the podcast, if you do need help with your training, we would love to help you achieve those goals with our Faster Beyond 50 training frameworks. We've helped over 10,000 runners over the age of 50 over the last decade or so, and we'd love to help you as well. So the link to that is in the description too. Anything you think we've missed on this podcast, or can we call it a wrap?
I was going to say that I know we've missed something, because these topics are quite broad and there's a lot, and we just didn't touch on equipment and making sure you're in the right shoes and checking your gear beforehand. So yeah, that'll have to come into a chat on another day. But blisters, things like wearing new socks on race day, not having run in a pair of shoes properly, that can really ruin your marathon. So yeah, I mean, I guess again, that just seems like such an obvious one, but people don't always think about that stuff. So yeah, there's probably one or two other little things that we possibly have forgotten about.
Yeah, and let me just say categorically that getting someone else to run in your bib for a faster marathon is also not a good idea.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually count, just for the record. Lindsey, as always, so great catching up. We look forward to catching up again next week. It's a Q&A episode next week, so make sure you get those questions in. The link is in the description. We filter the video questions up to the top. And just once again, thanks a lot to James Willock for leaving us that review on Apple Podcasts. We're going to send you a Coach Parry water bottle, James. We really do appreciate that as well. It does help other runners over the age of 50 find this podcast. So until next week, stay safe, look after yourself, and we'll chat soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.